Okay, well, we're going to go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone. The International Parking and Mobility Institute presents today's Shop Talk, how parking plays a key role in the new hybrid work environment. My name is Kristen Vitello, and I will be assisting Brett Wood, Tiffany Peebles, Glenn Kurtz, and Lena Price in moderating today's Shop Talk. As a reminder, today's Shop Talk is being recorded. We will post a recording to IPMI's YouTube channel in a few days. So before we start, I would like to go over just a few quick housekeeping rules for today. If you have a webcam and are comfortable doing so, we ask that you please turn on your camera. IPMI wants everyone to feel engaged and to participate, and we would like to see your smiling faces. We want this virtual shop talk to be just like the regular shop talks, face-to-face and sharing our ideas. As a reminder, we would like all participant lines to be muted. You may type your questions into the chat. To access the chat feature, click the chat icon and then type your questions or comments and click send. Now it is my pleasure to turn the audience over to Brett Wood. Brett?
Thank you, Kristen, and thanks everybody for joining us today. My name is Brett Wood. I am with Wood Solutions Group, but in regard to this call, I'm the co-chair of the Research and Innovation Task Force for IPMI. For those that don't know what we do, we're one of the committee task forces that is, our goal is to help the industry develop relevant materials that support the continued evolution and growth of our industry. And we've taken on a number of topics over the years, like curb lane management, mobility, the return to work and recovery from the pandemic. And in today's presentation, we're going to talk a little about one of the topics we're tackling this year, which is how the parking industry is responding to changing work conditions, specifically things like hybrid work conditions, working from home, and what that does to our overall industry. I am joined here today by three of my esteemed colleagues from the Research and Innovation Task Force: Tiffany Peebles from the Parking Authority of River City in Louisville, Kentucky, Lena Price from Auraria Higher Education Center, and Glenn Kurtz from Legacy Parking. And they each represent a different sector of our industry: municipality, the campus environment, and the private sector. And we specifically selected them to be a part of this discussion and ongoing discussions because they provide a really unique perspective on how those sectors of the industry are responding to these changing conditions in their community or on their campus. I'm going to go through a few things that we've learned as we've kind of started tackling this topic over the last few months. But as we get into the discussion of this shop talk today, we're going to break this into three different segments. There'll be a municipal segment. There will be a campus academic section, and then we'll end up with a private sector section. And as you're representing the part of the industry that you're part of, think about how you're beginning to approach changing work conditions and the return to work and how that's influencing your campus or community, because we're going to want to hear from you. And I will tell you, we're at a place right now where we don't have a definitive answer to tell you today. If you're on here looking for a silver bullet about how we're approaching the return to work, we don't have that yet. And that's because we haven't fully returned to work. Glenn and Lena and Tiffany and I were talking right before the call started about kind of that ongoing moving target of companies, campuses, businesses returning to work. We all thought it was going to be late summer, and then the Delta variant happened. We all thought it was going to be late fall, and then the Omicron variant happened. And now we're all targeting March, which is yesterday, starting yesterday. March, April, May is kind of that return to work. And you'll see in the news, in the media, there are a lot of articles and discussions about how larger companies, tech companies, finance companies are all beginning to chart that return to work. And what we're hoping to do through this research effort today and ongoing through the rest of the year is document specific case studies and activities that you can think about in your community or campus moving forward as the return to work happens in those areas. So I'm going to start with just a little bit about what's driving this change. And, as we think about changing commute patterns, everybody really thinks this is a COVID-driven, pandemic-driven issue. But, in reality, there was a movement pre-pandemic to begin to look at a changing work environment. And before 2019, there were almost 6 million employees who teleworked a majority of the time. They worked from home, they worked remotely, they might have gone into the office periodically. And some of you may know folks like that. In my prior career, I was beginning to move into a telework situation, and we were seeing that grow in our company. Regular telecommuting grew more than 200% between 2005 and 2019, right before the pandemic. And the entire workforce only grew about 20%. So it was becoming more popular in the workforce. Now, not everybody can telework, not everybody can remote work, but it is something that you think about. Skill-based and educational-based businesses are really starting to think about where we can put our employees to manage that and provide flexible options. During the pandemic, almost 70% of the workforce worked remotely at some point, and there was quite a bit of that remote work happening at the beginning of the pandemic, and that's beginning to transition from a remote work perspective into more of a hybrid work condition. And when we talk about hybrid work in today's discussion, that means we work a couple of days at home or remote, and we work a few days in the office, and that balance may change on a week-to-week basis. But it gives workers flexibility, and it gives employers flexibility to have different approaches to the way that they set up their workforce. And then finally, we probably heard quite a bit about the Great Resignation over the past few months, but in reality, it's a great reshuffling. So a lot of workers have come out of the pandemic looking for a different experience from work. It's no longer just about the financial aspect; it's about the fulfillment aspect. Having the types of elements that you need in your job to support the work-life balance that you're looking for. And so a lot of what you're hearing from a resignation standpoint are people making decisions to go to places that offer them these types of amenities or this type of flexibility, which is central in us looking for solutions from a parking perspective to support this changing environment. So one of our first tasks as the Research and Innovation Task Force for this effort was to gather information. As we started thinking about how do we want to address what this looks like long term, let's understand what our industry is facing. And so we set up a survey that went live about a month ago. It is still live now. If you'd like to take it, we're going to continue to gather information as we continue to evolve this topic over the next few months. So there's the survey link. There's also a QR code, and one of our colleagues from IPMI can certainly put this in the chat and give you a link to the survey if you want to take it. But what I'm going to do is go through a few of the survey responses that we've seen so far over the last month and what they're telling us about the return to work and how our industry is beginning to address that. So I'll start with what's your preference on how you personally work in the future? We asked each respondent to tell us how they wanted to work. 65% of respondents indicated they wanted to have some type of hybrid work environment where they work sometime at home, sometime in the office. About 30% were full-time, and about 6% were full-time work from home. And this charts with what we're seeing in the larger business and employment industry, as there's a mixture of folks. Some really want to get back to the office full-time. Some have really embedded themselves in the remote work environment. But the majority of folks are looking for some type of option that gives them some flexibility, and that's what we're looking to respond to. We asked each respondent to tell us how their organization was approaching the return to work for their staff. And keep in mind, these are parking and mobility organizations with a lot of frontline staff that probably don't have the ability to do full-scale work from home. So you can see about 60% of the respondents indicated that they were in a full-time return to work in the office. And truthfully, many of those were never out of the office during the pandemic. About 30% are doing a hybrid return to work, and then about 13% are still working from home. So predominantly in our industry, we're seeing more people in the full-time return to work. We also asked respondents, how is this going on in your community or in your campus beyond just your organization? And we are seeing about a 45% full-time return to work, 31% hybrid work environment, and a 23% work from home. So you can see the differences in people's perceptions and preferences, what their actual organization is doing and what their community is doing. And then lastly, we asked them what we anticipated that shift to be full-time. And again, 50% full-time return to work, 30% hybrid work environment, and an 18% work from home. And it's interesting that our industry landed on this. It's not that big of a difference from where we are right now looking at the previous slide. But more so, when you look at what some of the industry's employment and economic projectors are saying, there's an expectation that about 25 to 30% of the workforce will continue remote work on a multiple days a week basis. That's become kind of the landing spot, full projection for folks when we think about what hybrid work looks like in the future. So by all indications, we're getting relatively close to that now, at least based on our industry's responses to the survey, as well as what we're seeing in certain communities, how folks are returning to work. So the overall impact of that, well, if we think about this not from a parking perspective, but from a workforce perspective, a large portion of the workforce is going to have a dramatic change in the way they're able to work. And benefits won't necessarily always be financial. Some of it's more autonomy related or flexibility related. But the biggest detriment to having a hybrid or remote workforce is the idea of team building and collaboration is a little more splintered than it would have been pre-pandemic. And so the idea of the hybrid work environment is to be able to bring teams together periodically and then allow them to go back and do their work remotely in a way that's a little more flexible and in tune with their work-life balance. From an office space perspective, this is what I find to be most interesting. If you think about our downtowns today that are largely built as commercial centers with a lot of office space, we're going to begin to reimagine a lot of that office space because we won't need offices for every people, cubicles for every people. And this becomes a situation where we can begin to reimagine what the office looks like. It's much more collaboration driven and team driven and less office space driven. That also gives us more real estate to bring people into the downtown, whether that's additional office workers or other types of uses, or even residential repurposing of those office spaces. Currently, right now, most corporations aren't downsizing, but they are considering downsizing space as they move out of the pandemic. And then finally, what we're really here to talk about today is on the parking industry. As you think about the parking industry, especially in the municipal environment and the academic campus environment and the private sector environment, a lot of our operations are driven on full-time permit holders. We sell monthly permits, we sell annual passes on campus, and everything about our business has been oriented in that direction. And as we start seeing more variability in those commuters, we start seeing less full-time permit holders, or we see permits that aren't being utilized at the level they were utilized pre-pandemic. We may see large corporations opt out of buying permits and go to the daily parking model. But there's also opportunities for us to begin to reorient the way that we're providing options to our consumers by thinking about hybrid permits, daily passes, flexibility, those types of things. And so that's what we're getting into now as part of the research. What is it that the industry is doing and how are we responding to things? So a couple more survey questions, and then I'll dive into some case studies, and I'll stop talking and turn it over to my colleagues who can tell you a little more about the real world. But we asked folks about how parking revenues or demands have been affected by the changing work environment so far. And you can see primarily monthly revenue is down. Again, goes back to we may be losing monthly customers who are choosing other options or moving into full remote work. And then you can see transient revenue is down. And this is a symptom of not just office parking, but just changing demand patterns in our downtowns anyway, as people are coming back for events and destinations, but not necessarily for the things that they might have come back beforehand. If you've not sat in on an IPMI shop talk over the last 2 years, these numbers are dramatically better than they've been in the past 6 to 8 months. They're getting better on a day-to-day basis, and we're seeing our revenues return to normalcy. But there may be ways that we have to think about these revenue and demand patterns in a different way to achieve a different revenue profile for our organizations going forward. And then we ask folks, are there any specific programs that have been implemented to support this new commute work environment. So the first column is flexible or hybrid permits. So 30% of the respondents indicated that they were thinking about that or were doing something with a flexible or hybrid permit. Second is scratch off permits. Essentially, you buy 30 uses and you use them as you go. Not as many people looking to use that, but there were a few that are beginning to go down that path. Daily or hourly parking options, maybe even discounted or marketed as an alternative to permits. That was the biggest response that we're seeing so far from the industry, is they're really shifting people kind of to the daily or hourly platform. Doing prepayment options for commuters so that they know they have a parking space without having to buy the permit. Doing commute parking reservations. And then some of these others are actually tools that we were using pre-pandemic from a transportation demand management perspective, but we're seeing people implement those as we're trying to influence the way people commute. Things like transit incentive for employees or per-use payment options. And we'll talk about some of those examples in the case studies as we get into those. So I'll finish with just one example that I've got. So for those that don't know me, I'm a consultant, but for the last 11 months, I've actually been the interim CEO of the Birmingham, Alabama Parking Authority, which has been really interesting because it allowed me as a consultant to really try out a lot of the things that I try to force on people in my consulting role. And some of those things were fun, and some of those, I learned that maybe we shouldn't force those on people. But one of the things we tried was, what can we do to support the downtown business environment and the downtown business community as they rethink their return to work? And in my first month of doing this interim CEO gig, one of our biggest permit holders just pulled all their permits. They were buying close to 1,000 permits a month, and they pulled all their permits because they weren't expecting a return to work. And we started getting a little bit nervous about would other permit holders do that. And so I started really diving into data to understand which employers were coming back, which had not yet come back, and what that return to work looked like. And we saw two different trend patterns for a lot of our municipal city employee customers and or government customers. There was a slow but steady return to the office as those offices opened. But for a lot of our financial sector and technology-based companies, the permit usage on a month-to-month basis had completely dropped to almost zero uses during the peak months of the pandemic, and then about 5% of their uses per month on an ongoing basis. So they were really not using what they were paying for. So we started reaching out to them and asking questions about their return to work and how could we support it. And we entered into a pilot study with a couple of those companies to look at what would happen if we began a different type of return, and what would be the impact on those employers, and what would be the impact on the parking authority. And in midsummer 2021, we started this pilot, and we'll be wrapping it up next month. And really, it was just a review of how those employees were coming into the office. Were they using daily parking options and permit parking options? And what could we design with those employers in mind after that pilot period? So this is a chart just kind of giving us some of the results of the data analysis that we've done. And we've gone through a number of data points with these employers to help them understand how their employees are responding to things. But this is the volume of transactions we were seeing on a daily basis from those 1,000 employees that were part of the pilot program. And most of those employers had marked October 15th-ish to come back into the office. And again, this is pre-Delta. And then the plan was they were going to scale people into the office and have about 50% of their employees in the office at any given time. And so you can see, in the third week of our pilot, we had a peak where people were coming to the office pretty full force. And then that began to plateau over the 5 or 6 weeks afterwards. And then as we got into the holiday season, it dropped dramatically. And even at the beginning of the year, in early January, we haven't seen a return yet just because of issues from the Omicron variant. So we're going to begin to look at February and March and make decisions about how these hybrid permit are implemented more full time. But some of the results were, we never saw more than about 25 to 30% of the employees coming in on a given day. And it wasn't the same employees. We had different employees coming in, but never more than 25% of the total pool. looking at all of the permit holders in aggregate, they averaged about 2 to 2.5 days in the office per week over the life of the pilot, which gave us a good sense that they weren't going to be coming in every day. And if we went to a hybrid type of permit program, we would be able to establish some KPIs that allowed us to do a little bit more oversell in our facilities on those days that they weren't coming in. Unsurprisingly, the primary days of the week that they were coming in were Tuesday and Thursday. The day that had the least amount of people coming in was Friday. And as we think about a hybrid approach to parking and balancing demand, there's always the concern that, you know, the midweek surge of people coming into the office and then taking 4-day weekends, working from home Monday and Friday, it doesn't really provide us the opportunity to do some additional oversell in our facilities. But if we can work with the employers to make sure that they stagger their employees, we should be able to create options for them that are more flexible and provide us tools to continue to fill up our facilities. So our next steps, we've gotten to the point where we're beginning to design the system. And with each employer, we're going to set up a daily maximum for the number of permit holders they can have in the facility. So they may have 600 employees, but we're going to tell them they can have 150 permits at any given time, and that's all they have to pay for. Full price for 150, and all 600 employees get a permit. On the days where more than 150 people show up, they'll pay us the full price for anybody above that 150 for the daily parking. So they're getting a discount on the overall number of permits, but on days where the demand is higher, we'll be able to account for that overage and help support the ongoing operation of the facility. And then we'll just continue adjusting this on an ongoing basis. We've run some numbers that allow us to understand how many more people we can put into the facility based on these thresholds that we're setting and how many days we may have overages. And you know, one of the biggest concerns about this approach to hybrid permits is there's going to be less revenue associated with it. We're not selling 600 permits and we're only selling 150. We're obviously going to have less revenue, but if we can squeeze more people into the facility and oversell at a better rate, those numbers begin to balance over time with the increased demand, and we're serving more people in the community. So that's just one approach. And you know, as we go through this continued research effort with the R&I task force, we'll continue to document this approach that I've been involved in, but also with my colleagues that are going to be on the call in a second. And then for those of you that are responding to the survey, we've also got case study information we'll be publishing later this year that will give you guidance on many different approaches to this. And with that, I'm going to stop rambling now, and we're going to move into the municipal side of things. And I'd like to ask my colleague, Tiffany Peoples from Louisville, to give us a little bit of a sense of how she's seeing things and what they're planning for in Louisville. And as she's talking, if you're in the municipal realm, think about some of these questions. How are you approaching the changing commute? What data are you using to make decisions? What are your challenges? And what are your concerns? And if you want to respond in the chat, we'll be moderating the chat, and we may call on you afterwards. We may just read your statement, but we'd love to hear from you as we go through this. So I'll stop there. Tiffany, take it away.
Thank you, Brett. Yeah, absolutely. A lot of the information that Brett shared regarding what was taking place in Birmingham is very similar to what we're doing in Louisville as well. We've been very fortunate that our monthly parking permits or payment of those permits has not changed drastically. It's been amazing, but we have two major corporations here in Louisville, and we had been in close communication with them almost immediately when the pandemic occurred, and we had felt that they would cancel a great deal of their parking. We've been kind of on edge for the last 2 years for them to do that. And I personally believe, because that's not their main line of business, right? They're focusing on other things other than parking, that we've been the beneficiary of them not focusing on parking. But we stay in constant communication with them. We basically have a meeting with them every other week to just take their pulse about what their intentions entail. And we are finding that now they are expecting to only maintain about 60% of their monthly parking, which is going to be a huge impact to our budget. But what we are asking of them is to take advantage of some of the hybrid options that Brett explained earlier. We also have that a la carte feature where they can go in and purchase maybe 2 to 3 days a week ahead of time. So they prepay for those, not the employee, but the employee goes in on a particular account, a company's account, and they make the determination of what days of the month they're going to need parking. And then they receive a pass for those days, and then they're allowed to use so many days a month. Very similar to what Brett was explaining, we try to max that out. We're looking for that mix, and we haven't quite achieved that yet because, as I said, they've delayed canceling their monthly parking. But once they do, we're looking for that mix that will give us an opportunity to allow more daily parkers to come in and actually at a higher rate. So that's one of the things that we're trying to do is manage that, how many hybrid permits that we are allowing in, and then trying to create some new revenue from a daily permit perspective. One of the things that we are having a challenge with right now is that we have the corporations that want to just kind of cherry pick when they come in, and our software doesn't allow them that type of flexibility. That we need them to be able to go in and know what days they're coming in, or predetermine that, and not just be able to at a whim be able to charge that back to the account. So we are having some type of limitations with that, and I would be interested in those that what type of services that they're using. Another thing that we have offered is discounted parking for rooftop parking. So if people are willing to come in, we started this as an initiative, hoping that this would encourage some people to come back and that the parking rates would not be a deterrent, but we introduced it to last to the end of 2021, and we've extended it. We haven't had the type of membership that we thought we would get from it, but those that are taking advantage of it, we are encouraged by those, and we don't want to take it away from them. So for right now, we don't have any plans to discontinue what is a 50% discount if they agree just to park on the roof. We don't have any fear of that being a occupancy issue right now, because while we are still having at least 80% of the monthly parking paid for that we had pre-pandemic, we probably are seeing less than 50% of occupancy in our garages. So this would include monthly and transient. So we still don't have a lot of people. We know there's still not a lot of people coming back downtown. So we're looking at discount parking. We're doing the pre-parking, as I mentioned, and then we are trying to adjust our rates to accommodate. So I'm really interested to see if other cities have looked to increasing rates to account for the reduction of hybrid parking or the reduction of monthly parkings that we know is coming down the pipeline. So we do have a huge delta, as I mentioned, between the two, and we're hoping to, we're looking to, like, out of the box thinking of how we can account for this empty garages that we didn't have before. What we have seen is that through events or that people are just excited to be back out. So we have been seeing an increase in transient parking, our on-street parking, and event parking. And those are some areas that we are making a decision if we're going to increase some of those rates to account for the loss in the monthly parking. That's about all I have to share, but it's like I said, I was encouraged, and I'm sure other municipalities are encouraged as well, of some of the similarities that we're seeing come out of Birmingham.
So Tiffany, there's a question in the chat. How are you pricing the hybrid permit approach in Louisville compared to your monthly and transient rates?
Yeah, actually, it's a little higher than what the daily rates are, and we basically went back to take a look at what our monthly rates are and the number of days that we thought that they would use those. And obviously, we know the monthly rates were previously discounted, so we tried to have a mix between the two. I'm happy to share that website, because with each of each of the companies that come down, we individually set up a separate account for them to go in, and we don't have, so say if it's an account that is just generic, someone wants to come in and they want to take advantage of it, the rates that are offered to them are not the same rates that are being offered to some of our major corporations, but the generic company can't see the rates that are being offered to the major corporation. They just go in and they choose their particular, if it's generic, they just go in and say that they're trying to take advantage of those hybrid monthly permits. Versus if they're a Humana, they go to a particular account just for Humana. So they don't see those rates, and it allows us some flexibility to try to win business over, because now, as we know, they have options and we're trying to sell them on our garage. So if the smaller individuals that are going in to buy those maybe are not as prices sensitive to the bulk that are coming from some of the major corporations. So they're not the same. We are using some consideration for that.
Thank you. And one last question for you, Tiffany, and then we'll move into the campus side. So Lena, 2-minute notice. So there was a question about how would enforcement of rooftop parking occur if they're required to maintain a physical hang tag? What would stop them from removing the hang tag? So any thoughts on how you're approaching that?
Yeah, we are really moving away from hang tags as much as possible, because we have license plate recognition vehicles that we use. And so anytime that they submit for an application for any monthly parking, we initially use those license plates to offer an extra layer of customer service. If we saw someone left their lights on, left their trunk open, and then we would be able to reach out to them. So now we're using them for enforcement. If we happen to notice that they're not on the rooftop, then we're not as strict as we are in normal times. But if we see that they're being abusive of it and they continue to take advantage of the rooftop rate, but they're not using the roof, we would reach out to them and we would give them a friendly reminder that they needed to be on the roof. But that's how we go about it. We use the license plate recognition.
Thank you so much. And thank you for all that information. That was fantastic. So we're going to move now to the university side of our discussion. And I'll ask Lena Price to join in and tell us a little what's going on the campus that she works on. Again, same questions. If you've got thoughts or questions for Lena, put them in the chat and we will address them. Lena, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and welcome everyone. I'm excited for this to get things back going. And it's National Women's Month. Woo. Here on the Auraria campus, we're in Denver, Colorado, and we're centrally located in downtown Denver. We are surrounded by some major venues, our NFL or our stadium. We also have our arena where we have our hockey and professional basketball games, concerts, and things like that. We also recently just inherited a Meow Wolf, which is a huge interactive museum that is bringing lots of customers to town. Also, the unique thing about our campus is we are one of the only campuses that are tri-institutional. So I have 3 major universities. I have University of Denver, I have Metropolitan State University, and we have the Community College of Denver, all located on our campus. COVID, we did about a 50% layoff. A lot of people were able to work remote. However, as Brett alluded to, it's hard to do that in parking because you need to physically be here. I did have some administrative employees that were allowed to work remote, but they are since back and we are 100% back in the office. Some of the things that we are doing to approach this hybrid work, we are providing other modes of transportation. So each institution, as well as Auraria, agreed to purchase free eco passes, which are basically transit bus passes. So you can ride public transportation for free, and we are providing those to all students, faculty, and staff. We're also doing some of what Tiffany talked about and Brett. We are doing a flexible permit passport where students, faculty, and staff can contour their permit or their passport based on the number of days that they're on campus. So if they're here Monday, Wednesday, Friday, they can buy a 3-day permit. If they're here one day, or they can buy a full week pass, which also allows them here on the weekends to attend events at any of the venues that are surrounding the campus. We've also implemented a carpool rate. That's only in one of our garages that are still manned by huts. Have passengers, you get $1 off the daily fee for parking for carpooling. We're also installing more EV stations. We currently have 18 on campus, and we're looking to install 10 more. We do not charge to charge, we just charge to park. So that's an additional benefit that we're trying to do to encourage people to drive if they need to. We also have a validation process where one can request a validation, and we bill the customer based on the number of uses from that validation. That's been a huge success too, because people are purchasing those, well, different entities on campus are purchasing those validations for guests, any kind of events that they may be hosting specifically. That's been a huge hit for us as well. And on campus, we have about 6,500 parking spaces for 42,000 students. So we try to encourage turnover. We did up our rates for event parking. So after 5 p.m., the rate goes up to one standard fee of $15 and $20 in our Tivoli garage, which is the most frequently used by outside entities. So our transient parking has picked up more so than the return of students, faculty, and staff. For each institution, the numbers are down, and that's one of the ways that we base our decisions on. And what we have to be very careful about is not to put the burden on the employees that are still here when raising prices. It seems a little unfair that you got to pay to go to work when you're going to work to get paid. And we hear that a lot from employees that have struggled through the pandemic, that, you know, I'm coming to get paid, but I have to pay a lot in parking just to have somewhere. So they are using other modes of transportation. I do have a plan in place right now currently where we're doing a sliding scale based off of employees' pay. We have minimum wage all the way up to whatever our CEO makes. And so we are trying to adjust our prices for employees for those purposes as well. We also have a registration process where if you are student, faculty, and staff, you can register your vehicle. That way you get the daily rate only, even when our event rates go into play. Your license plate is registered in our system, and when you go to put your information in, it charges you just the daily rate. We also are starting to pick back up on special events. So our event services here on campus is starting to do a lot of weddings. We have a few car shows that are scheduled for the summer in our garages. We are thinking about charging to charge so that some of that revenue can go back to some of the maintenance of the stations and paying for them. We are the revenue generator here on campus. There are other auxiliary services, but by far we are the richest, not to say money-wise, just the cash cow. I think that is a pretty general overall outlook on what we're trying to implement. Our offices are down with occupancy. It's tough having 4 different entities on campus because each of them want something different. The demographic of students are different and what they can afford, especially with our community college. We also have a full-time childcare center on campus, and for parents that are coming either working on campus or just using that facility, we're trying to work something out with them so that that hardship is not there to be a barrier for them returning to work with their kids as well.
Thanks, Lena. That sounds like you're doing quite a bit. And I know in the academic world, there's a huge difference in the way we interact with our customers because they're also our colleagues and our students. And there's a nimble touch that you have to have. So I appreciate all that you are providing. And a lot of the examples that we saw from other universities are doing a lot of the same things, thinking about flexibility and really educating people on choice so that they know what's in front of them from a parking, work, transportation perspective. So thanks, Lena.
Yes, thank you.
So our last portion of our presentation, but definitely not the least, I want to talk about the private sector. And I'm going to turn it over to my friend Glenn Kurtz from Legacy Parking to tell us a little bit about how the private sector is approaching the return to work in a different commute environment. And again, same questions. If you want to talk about the private sector, put it in the chat. If you got questions for Glenn, put it in the chat. Glenn, take it away.
Thanks, Brett. So yeah, I'm with Legacy Parking. We're a private parking management company, and we basically manage parking operations for third parties. And the majority of, and I'm based in Atlanta, Georgia, so not far from Birmingham. So you'll get that perspective, but our company is also in Chicago and we run a lot of operations up there. So I'll sort of comment on that. I think that the biggest thing is that it's all very similar, but very different, right? And I think that's the case even with these other speakers that we heard in other industries, municipality and universities, very similar, but different. I think the big thing with regard to the private sector is that we're dealing, and with us, we deal primarily with Class A office buildings and managing those operations. So once again, pandemic, all those people left. I think the trends are very similar across industries and employees. But what really sort of ties our hands to a degree in this industry are the leases. Everybody has a lease that's in a Class A office building, every tenant, and that lease can be as long as 10 years. So what happens is that very often, if you're in a lease, your parking and the amount of parking you get, and in many cases, the price of parking that you get is dictated by your lease. So as a result, you're kind of locked in. If you just signed your lease, right before the pandemic, you're locked in for 8 years right now. And that office building is generally not going to be flexible with that lease. Now, that's not everywhere, but that does some degree tie the hands of flexibility, if you will, in this area. Now, if you're near the end of your lease and you're starting to have conversations about renewing your lease, or you're looking at even signing a new lease to get into a new building, then much more flexible. That building owner and manager is going to, start to get a little more flexible and maybe offer you some options with regard to how to address your unique challenges with people working from home or flexible work schedules and that type of thing. So what we've seen primarily on the private sector side are two types of flexibility, and they've already been discussed. One is what we call carpooling. This is the discussion that Brett brought up about providing 500 passes, but only 100 of those people are allowed into the deck at any given time, because that's what it says in your lease. You're allowed 100 parkers. If 101 cars ends up, or the 101st car that ends up in that deck, it either doesn't allow them in, or they have to take a transient ticket at that point, and they're just treated like a transient parker. If a couple people leave and you're down to 98, then people can start coming back into the deck. So we are seeing that being requested in almost all new leases. We're seeing that request occurring in a lot of places. We're seeing that request occur in new leases. when they're looking for office space and renewing leases as well. With regard to the flexible parking rates, and we're also just going back to the carpooling, we're seeing a lot of employers, tenants themselves requesting that throughout. With regard to the flexible parking, which is sort of the other type of flex parking, which is really a pricing issue. And it's I'm no longer coming into the office every day. I'm going to be there 3 days a week. I want something that is more expensive maybe than my monthly pass on a daily basis and less expensive than the hourly rate, the transient rate. We're seeing, at least in Atlanta, which I think is unique for a couple situations, very, very little of that occurring, actually, on the private side. And once again, I think it's because leases don't require that. I think there's some concern, as we've also discussed, about revenues, about maintaining the integrity of the inventory of parking garages if you have too much of that going on. So we're not seeing a lot of that. The other unique thing about Atlanta is that the monthly rate is pretty cheap already. I mean, we're practically giving the parking away as it is, although people and drivers don't feel that way. But our monthly parking rates are some of the lowest of any major metropolitan city, ranging from $45 a little bit outside the city to $85 in our core, up to a maximum of $150. So you're talking about $4 a day, $5 a day. You get unlimited uses of the parking. I mean, there's no going below that, that's for sure. And once again, we have to find where that sweet spot is, maybe above that if we were to offer it. So we are seeing that being requested by individuals and employees themselves. We're seeing some employers talk about it, but we're not seeing a lot of movement with regard to that type of thing from the building owners and managers. Not yet. And I think there's a desire to sort of wait and see what's going to happen and how it's going to settle out. I'll make two other sort of quick comments so that we have maybe a little time for questions as well at the end. But what we also are aware of as part of this discussion in Atlanta is because rates are so low in the scheme of things, that you don't see a lot of innovation in technology with regard to the Atlanta market. Now, we're seeing pay by phone and certain things like that come into the market, but you're not going to invest a good bit of money into your infrastructure if you're really not making a lot of money on your monthly rates and your parking. You go to Chicago, where rates are $650 a month, then you're going to invest. You're going to invest in your technology. You're going to invest in certain things in order to push traffic. The other thing that I'll talk about a little bit in the Chicago market, which to me is, and in New York and some of these major metropolitan cities, which we are seeing real innovation come out of those, is the fact that it's much more competitive, and parking decks are not per se attached to a particular office building. So you may have a parking deck, and it serves the whole 4 square blocks around it, and you're competing against other parking decks in that regard to really pull those people in. You're also competing with the transit system, which a tremendous number of people use. That's a little different in Atlanta as well. So what we're seeing in Atlanta, and this is sort of a bit revealing, I think, which the pandemic has done across the board, kind of reveals things. And I think this was occurring a little bit, but we are seeing some real flexibility in pricing and options like that. We're actually seeing a movement towards pricing where instead of you get a monthly pass, you might get the value of that in minutes. And you've got those minutes, and you can use those across multiple assets. So you don't even have to park them, for example, in that one deck. You can actually say, I've got 2,000 minutes to use, and I'm going to be going over here to dinner. I'm going to actually use those minutes over at another legacy property. So that's something that we're one of the sort of innovative things we're seeing. We call it sort of a drive forward type of thing, where you have it's valid at multiple legacy locations. We also have a flex permit, which once again converts your monthly pass into minutes as well. And then, we are also exploring, and this is still very early, we're piloting a lot of this, and it's not sort of out there across the board, is daily, weekly, monthly passes, right? So this is something we haven't historically seen in the parking industry, but you can definitely buy a daily pass on the transit system or a weekly pass on the transit system in Atlanta or a monthly pass. And in parking, we really haven't offered that generally. So we are starting to see sort of the technology allow this to happen. And then for the providers to provide what the customers want in that regard. But once again, we're kind of seeing that in these more sort of competitive, more expensive parking markets. Maybe I'd even dare say more sophisticated parking markets. But that's sort of what we're seeing and where we're at in the private sector.
Thank you, Glenn. And the South is plenty sophisticated. Don't let people know.
Not taking that away at all.
One comment, and I actually have a question for you. So it's fascinating, and anybody that's on the call that has kind of a background in transportation demand management or in transportation planning, it took a global pandemic for us to begin to start implementing some of these tools that really push people to make daily decisions and more granular decisions than just buying a parking permit. And I've spoken with a number of university-based parking directors that have said, we've moved to a daily parking model. I know UC Davis, I think, is on the call. They've done this and it's going swimmingly for them right now, and other campuses are doing it. And it's just fascinating to me that we ran into so many roadblocks to make it work going forward before the pandemic. And now it's basically the choice du jour for a lot of the employers. They want to have those flexible options that allow their folks to make decisions. On your drive forward pass that you talked about, so you're essentially selling minutes of parking, which is fascinating. What is the cost per minute compared to like the cost per minute of a regular permit? Is it the same price, or is it priced differently?
It's basically the same price at this point. Well, it's not the same price as transient parking. It's sort of equated into a monthly type of usage. And we are still playing with it, and we're still rolling it out. So we're still playing around with rates and thinking through those type of things. But we haven't zeroed in on the right amount. But revenue is kind of king in the private sector for sure. We're not kind of like universities per se that might be more like we can't make a profit, for example, because they're an auxiliary service, or having those issues. We're all pushing as hard as we can to make as much revenue as possible. And the other thing is that we're not in general trying to push people to use an alternative, right? Per se. Now we will do that in cases where demand is a challenge for a particular tenant or employer or building, that type of thing. So this is a pilot. We haven't really started it yet, so we don't have any data, but I think this is where the industry might be heading, which is really getting flexible with regard to, what kind of rates might be available to people.
It is fascinating. And I mentioned this at the beginning of the presentation. We don't have the silver bullet answer right now because we're all still trying to figure out what the new normal and new work environment looks like. But I would invite you, if you're coming to New Orleans in July, to come join us in the air-conditioned conference room. We're going to be presenting this topic again, but with more detail about things like that drive forward and what we're seeing as people return to work. So please join us then. And if you've got any questions or things you'd like to add, the survey is in the chat, and you can find information about the Research and Innovation Task Force on the IPMI website. Reach out to us. Let us know what you're doing. We'd love to include it in the overall summary materials. And thank you all very much for joining us. I'm going to turn it back over to Kristen now, and Kristen, you can take us home.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Brett. So we hope you can join us again on May 4th for our next shop talk on impartial policies and curbside equity. That'll be moderated by Matthew Darst. And on September 7th, 2022, we will be hosting a shop talk on innovations at the curb, moderated by Robert Farron-Cat. I would like everyone to invite everyone to continue their conversations in IPMI's forum at forum.parking-mobility.org. And a little bit about conference. Our early bird registration is now open for IPMI's Parking and Mobility Conference and Expo, and it will be made available until March 25th. The conference will be held in New Orleans from July 24th through July 27th, and we encourage everyone to register, and we look forward to seeing you all there. And lastly, IPMI's annual call for awards and recognition programs celebrate individuals and organizations in the parking and transportation and mobility industry. Winners in the awards of excellence and professional recognition exemplify industry excellence. And the call for 2022 awards is open now and will run through March 15th. We also invite you to visit our Stay Connected page. Our community has a long history of being resourceful and helpful during both good and difficult times. And we want to thank you for your membership, your support, your willingness to jump in and connect, and your dedication to our industry. So with that, I want to give a huge shout out to Brett Wood, to Tiffany Peebles, to Glenn Kurtz, and Lena Price for facilitating today's incredible Shop Talk. Thank you all for attending. You may now disconnect. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.